words. They're not asking the correct questions. When you don't ask the right question, you're never going to get the right answer. The right question is, how do we articulate to the American people, the average voter, who we have to trust as believers in individual liberty, as believers in rational thought and conscious action and free will, we have to trust the electorate to be savvy enough to understand the arguments that we're making for liberty. We have to trust them to understand these arguments. And how can you trust them to understand the arguments if you're not making the arguments? Now, the average American, I think, will figure it out pretty quickly when you start telling them about Chuck, for example, and all of the regulations that stop and prevent Chuck from opening a business. Because the average American, folks, knows someone like Chuck. Or maybe the person in the audience that you're talking to happens to be Chuck. They happen to have had some of the same exact experiences that the fictional character Chuck from that audio has had. When you start talking in these simple terms about vast problems in this country, people will generally understand what you're talking about. Now, you may have to make these arguments a little bit more simple, because the fact of the matter is our educational system has been dominated by the progressives for so damn long that people aren't taught critical thinking skills anymore. So maybe you have to dumb down the argument, not saying that your audience is dumb, but that they have been dumbed down themselves intentionally by the progressive education system. So you have to make the arguments simple. But how simple is it to make the argument? 86,000 pages in the Federal Regulatory Code just last year. That's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple concept. And people can generally understand, wait a minute, 86,000 pages of federal regulations in 1 year added to the Federal Register. That's not counting the year before, and the year before that, and the decades before that. Or you can go to usdebtclock.org, which I just did earlier in the show, and talk about the unfunded liabilities, not the national debt. Oh, well, the U.S. national debt is $16 trillion. Well, great. You know, it's about $250 billion more than the unfunded liability for Social Security. And it's nowhere near the unfunded liability for Medicare Part D, the Prescription Drug Act, of $21 trillion. Or what about Medicare? The big third rail, the elephant in the room that no one dares talk about because you'll be accused of wanting grandma to eat dog food while you're pushing her over a cliff, for God's sakes. $84 trillion in unfunded liabilities for Medicare. Add just those three together, Social Security, prescription drugs, and Medicare, $121 trillion. Now, $121 trillion is a very large number, kind of hard to wrap your head around when the average American brings home, you know, maybe $1,000 every 2 weeks. 121 trillion is a huge concept, so you have to break it down. $121 trillion. You take the total national assets The total national assets in the United States of America, 87 trillion. You could sell off every single asset, every single private and public asset in this country, and you still come up almost $40 trillion short of our unfunded liabilities. That's a pretty simple argument to make, but nobody does it. Why is that? Liberty, folks, is a simple concept. And when the government grows so large that they can put 86,000 pages of regulations on the average American citizen on a yearly basis, there is something seriously wrong, and liberty has eroded to such an extent that you cannot properly call this a land of liberty anymore, can you? Going back to Frederick Bastiat and the law, man can only derive life and enjoyment from a perpetual search and appropriation, that is, from a perpetual application of his faculties to objects, or from labor. This is the origin of property, but also he may live and enjoy by seizing and appropriating the productions of the faculties of his fellow men. This is the origin of plunder. Now, labor being in itself a pain, and man being naturally inclined to avoid pain, it follows, and history proves it, that wherever plunder is less burdensome than labor, it prevails. And neither religion nor morality can, in this case, prevent it from prevailing. When does plunder cease, then? When it becomes more burdensome and more dangerous than labor. Think about that. When plunder becomes more burdensome and more dangerous than labor, it will cease. It is very evident that the proper aim of law, going back to, again, quoting Bastiat here, it is very evident that the proper aim of law is to oppose the fatal tendency to plunder with the powerful obstacle of collective force, that all its measures should be in favor of property and against plunder. But the law is made generally by one man or by one class of men, and as law cannot exist without the sanction and the support of a preponderant force, it must finally place this force in the hands of those who legislate. This can be summed up very simply. Government is force. The law is force. That's not a hard concept to understand. Government makes laws. Laws that, when you break them, eventually force will be employed against you. Very simple concept. The circle of liberty necessarily contracts in direct proportion. The circle of liberty necessarily contracts in direct proportion to the growth of government on whatever level, federal, state, or local. The larger your government is, the more it encroaches upon your individual choices. So when Nancy Pelosi stands on the floor of the House when they're getting ready to pass Harry Care and has the audacity to suggest that somehow putting the federal government in control of 16% of the nation's economy, putting the federal government in control of your health care choices, and mandating that you purchase a product is somehow going to expand your liberty. The fact that any person in America buys that ridiculous argument proves not that the American public is too stupid to enjoy the privileges of voting. No, it proves that the opposition to these concepts. The opposition to these arguments that the progressives have been making for 120 years was not sufficient. Let me read a bit from Conservapedia. This is the conservative encyclopedia, talking about the progressive era or the progressive movement. You can actually, I'm not going to read this. I posted the link on Twitter earlier this week, and by the way, if you're not following me on Twitter, you can do so at Bradley S. Reese. That's S for my middle initial, and Reese, R-E-E-S, 2 E's in the middle, none on the end. Make sure you spell that right. You can follow me there. I put this link out earlier this week, and you can find it pretty quickly from my Twitter page. But you can go to conservapedia.com/progressive_era, or just conservapedia.com and search progressive era. A very long entry on the progressive era, talking about the reform ideas of efficiency and social justice, women in the progressive era, prohibition, changing the Constitution, economic conditions, progressive politics, the role of journalism in the progressive era, purifying democracy, the antitrust laws, Teddy Roosevelt, Howard Taft, the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party, going on down the list, Woodrow Wilson, the election results of 1912, the Bull Moose Party disintegrating, and a very long list of notable progressive political leaders and notable progressive intellectuals, writers, and advocates, and footnotes, overviews, links to articles, etc. Now, in this very long page and all of these sources, there's one thing. I pointed this out on Twitter earlier this week, but I didn't give the full explanation. There's one notable thing that is missing from this article. It's the same problem that we have today, a huge problem. The same problem that we have today, and the cause for what happened this past Tuesday. In this entire article, all of the names, all of the dates, all of the information that is contained on this one page on Conservapedia about the progressive era, one thing that is missing from all of this is the names and the arguments of those who opposed the progressive movement. Think about that for a moment. Those who opposed progressivism, who were they? Why are they not listed here? Well, the fact of the matter is, the reason they're not listed here is because there weren't very many. Henry Cabot Lodge, and to a much lesser extent Oliver Wendell Holmes, were two of the most notable that stood up against progressivism. But they made a very weak and ineffectual defense of first principles. Why? Why was their defense of first principles weak and ineffectual? Why did the progressive movement carry on and gain so much strength as to accomplish their goal of radically transforming not only the Constitution and our society and culture, but the very way that we as Americans view our society and our culture and the founding era? Why was their defense of first principles so weak and ineffectual? Because they succumbed very quickly to the progressives' own terminology. The changing of the language, folks, this is why I talk about etymology so much on this show. because terms must be defined. If you do not define your terms, the other side will define them for you. And that's exactly